today's session. We are fortunate to have Kelly Bronson here today, and she's going to give about a 15 or 20 minute, about a 25 minute overview of the book, of her book, just for the benefit of the people who haven't had the privilege of reading it yet, it is a great read. And with that, I will introduce Dr. Rosita Dara, who's a professor in the School of Computer Science and also heavily involved in digital agriculture. And she's also going to highlight a conference she's heavily involved with organizing. So with that, I'll ask Rosita to introduce Kelly, but also to highlight her the conference coming up in June.
Great. Thank you very much, Kevin. And thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction. I was invited by Carrie, Graham, and Kevin to introduce Dr. Kelly Bronson, which I had the pleasure of knowing for a few years now. I know this webinar is not about me and you know what are some of the things that I do, but I asked for Kevin's permission to briefly talk about the conference we are organizing and the workshop. So if that's okay, I'm going to share my screen. Am I able to share the screen?
Yes, I made you co-host.
I just have one slide, just to show the conference team. So this is the first conference and the first workshop that we are organizing on digital innovation in agri-food in partnership. Obviously, the University of Guelph and Wageningen are leading it, but in partnership with Carrie as well and a few other partners. So the workshop is by invitation, which is by June 6th and 7th. We will have around 40 experts who have led or are working on major projects or small projects in agri-food. So it will be a discussion, presentation, and some discussion on future directions, possible collaboration opportunities, pilot projects, and all and those you know type of discussions. But we will present the findings on the conference day, which is on June 8th. So we have the conference, although it hasn't been that long that we have started organizing it, it has gone quite a bit of an attention. It seems to be a very hot topic. The theme of the conference, so this conference is, especially the last day, it's to a broader community for practitioners, basically policy makers, researchers, academics, technocrats, entrepreneurs, anybody who is interested. So we have been able to gather leads and kind of major initiatives from around the world to present some of their ideas or their initiatives either during the workshop or the conference. So it spans from Europe, Brazil, Peru, and then it is expanding some of the European countries and also US and Canada. So it has been very excited. We have also, we currently have few industry partners on board, DLT Labs, TELUS Agriculture, and a few other ones that we will post the information on the website. If there is any interest, I will put my email, and also I have asked Kevin to also put the conference website on the page. So if there's any interest to attend, or if you need more information about the conference, I'll be happy to answer. And we'll be happy to see participation from all experts and practitioners and academics, of course. So with that, I want to, I'll remove, let me just remove the slide. So the conference registration is open, but workshop, as I mentioned, it's just by invitation at this point, and it would be in person, both events. With that, I have a pleasure of introducing Dr. Kelly Bronson, who is a Canada Research Chair in Science and Society at University of Ottawa in Canada. She's a social scientist that studies the societal and ethical dimensions of controversial technologies and their governance, from GMOs to big data. She has published her work in national and international journals, so National Canadian Journal of Communication and international journals such as Science as Culture, Journal of Responsible Innovation, and Big Data and Society. She has just published a book on big data and AI in agriculture with McGill Queen's University Press, titled The Immaculate Conception of Data, Agribusiness Activities and Their Shared Politics of the Future. So with that, I will ask Kelly to take over. And Kelly just informed me that she would be participating in the workshop, which is very exciting. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the invitation today, and also to the summer workshop. I'm looking forward to that. Thanks everyone for attending today. So I'm going to share my screen and then I have some slides. So I'm going to give a run. We're basically going to have to run through my book that was published in September with McGill Queen's University Press. And the title of the book is The Immaculate Conception of Data, Agribusiness, Activists, and Their Shared Politics of the Future. So on the one hand, the book is about practices of data science, AI science, happening across various contexts of expertise within established and quite large agribusinesses like John Deere, the maker of the big green tractor, but also among public sector employees in Government of Canada and US Department of Agriculture, but also farmers who work in what I would call activist contexts of tech development, so self-labeled farmer hacktivists. So the book is ethnographic, it's empirically grounded, and so it's kind of hard to run through the book because it's rich in detail and stories really of people. But on the one hand, what I tried to do with the book was just descriptively get a sense of and then tell stories about what is happening with the science around AI and agriculture. You know, sometimes people call this digital agriculture, smart farming, agriculture 4.0. There's University of Guelph prof who's published an article on agriculture 4.0. And really this is, you know, the collection of data by equipment. So every John Deere tractor sold today passively collects data and then sends those data to cloud-based infrastructure. And then corporations like John Deere aggregate the data from across farm users. And then they use those so-called big data sets with algorithms, in some cases machine learning, to derive insights that the corporations sell farmers on when to or how to manage their operations. And so in the case of John Deere, farmers access those insights via a tablet, via an app, and they pay for those insights. So, you know, kind of like social media data, right, that's harvested in Shoshana Zuboff's term or collected as digital breadcrumbs online. From the moment a farmer opens the cab door, data is collected on the equipment, on the soil, on the farm practices, even on the farm labor. So I was really interested because, you know, amidst a lot of work, both kind of by activist groups and nonprofit, but also scholarship, a lot of work that's looked from a critical social science perspective at what's being done with social media data, or we might say personal data collected through internet behavior. There was really nothing when I set out to write the book looking at or really trying to trace what was done with data collected in an agricultural context. We might call it environmental data. And so I was really interested just descriptively to figure out what was being done, you know, following in part from folks like Virginia Eubanks and Kathy O'Neill and Sophia Noble, who have looked at, in fact, misuses, right, of personal data for the ways that data get wrapped up in the reproduction of harms, right, especially among those made marginal, like the reproduction of racism, for example. So I was wondering whether, you know, what was happening with the data, and if I could ask questions, as a social scientist does, about, you know, who was collecting the data and how are the data being used for whose gain and potentially whose harm, right? So a part of the book was just a descriptive intervention. And I have to say that figuring out what's being done with agricultural data was really difficult because the data sets collected by the corporations are aggregated into the big data sets, the algorithms that then deliver farmers advice, and even a lot of the scientists working in this domain are all, I would say, kind of hidden or obfuscated behind legal mechanisms like copyright law, intellectual property law, and trade secrecy law. So in some cases, I had to sign a non-disclosure agreement, but in many cases, employees, because of trade secrecy, were not really safe to speak. Even if I was really clear, I'm not interested in trade secrets, I'm not going to profit off of what you're talking about, it still made it very, very difficult. And I think that's a finding in and of itself. You know, for one, how can we validate how these tools work if we don't know, if these tools work, if we don't know how they work? So there's a kind of basic scientific validity or credibility question, but also to get at some of the social justice questions I was interested in asking. very difficult. Frank Pascal, the legal scholar who works in other domains, calls a lot of these artifacts, pernicious black box. So that's sort of something I wanted to put out there as a finding in and of itself. But I basically had to pivot, and about a year and a half into the book, I decided, well, I can talk with some scientists for sure, but what I need to do is I need to go to other spaces. And so I actually went to mostly spaces where scientists hang out in a commercial sense to promote, right, the outputs of their activities. So basically conventions and trade shows. And I looked at funding documents, and I carefully read license agreements, and looked at basically data that was openly available online. And I am able in the book to say some things about what is done or following from past corporate practice, and in this case, past practices among agricultural businesses, which, by the way, for those interested in big tech, conceived as Silicon Valley, agribusinesses were big tech far before Silicon Valley. They're the longest standing oligopoly corporations in the world. So I am able to say some things, some of which I publish in short, quick, quite easy to read pieces, like this piece for the conversation that I published last summer. So some of that is in the book. And I'll just maybe say two things today, because we don't have time to go into a lot. But one, especially from reading the financial documents and from reading, interestingly, the license and the use agreements around these tools, we could call it, these decision support platforms, which are AI-based for farmers, one really gets a clear sense that data are a source of revenue for agricultural businesses. And in the financial documents pitched at funders and venture capital pitches, this is explicit among the companies. And, I think just with social media, it's likely that the uses of data could entrench market power. And again, I write about this in detail in publications and even public-facing ones like this conversation piece. But here's just one sort of example. If you look even superficially at the commercially available tools for farmers that deliver farmers advice, those tools really only collect data on agronomic crops. So these are crops like soy and corn, right? Commodity crops, and they're grown typically for a host of complex environmental and historical and land use reasons on farms that are relatively large and powerful in the sense that those farmers have access to capital, or at least debt, right, in order to take on the new technologies. And so there's this, this is just one tiny little finding, and it's very it's visible at a superficial level, but actually just kind of like bias that we see in online data, for example, in a search algorithm, right, that's fed biased data and therefore reproduces racism. Similarly, and of course it's different and there are differences, but we see a kind of bias in the data collected and fed algorithms in the context of agriculture, such that these tools and the data sets that are fed these AI are reproducing, I would say, a kind of power in terms of a technological advantage among already powerful farms, right? Those which work in close connection with agribusinesses or industry. And there's so much I could say there, but we're on our run through the book. Okay. But there's a second level at which the book operates, and that's what gives the book its title. And actually, I didn't intend to write a book about the Immaculate conception of data at all. In fact, when I set out to write the book, I was really thinking it would be an empirically grounded in stories account of really these data science practices. And I was really interested, I had this hypothesis that there was all this interesting work happening among activists or farmer hacktivists, right, using open data and open innovation models to realize a particular vision for the future of digital agriculture. And then I had a sense that there was this stuff happening in private-led innovation among the John Deeres and the Monsantos, or the Bayer Monsantos. And that there were these sort of two models for the potential future realization, right, of AI-driven agricultural and social change. And I thought, oh, I'll just compare them. And then actually, after 2 years of field work, spending time with all of these people, I noticed something interesting, that despite differences, there was this pervasive, I would call it ideologically versatile, way that everyone was talking about data. And And that's what I call the immaculate conception of data. So let's get into this. So in 2012, so this is a long time ago now, and Rosita actually in 2015 already saw me use this. This is like a gift to sociologists, this video. John Deere, the big green tractor corporation, released this video, which is an odd kind of text because it didn't at the time, nor does it still show commercially available technologies. It was very it was a prognostication. In fact, they asked the question, how will technology change the future of farming? And the video was released on social media. And, John Deere Corporation presents an answer that you get a sense of, right, when you watch even just a few minutes of this video. Their answer to this question, how will AI in particular and digital, but in particular big data, right, and algorithmic technologies change the future of farming? Their answer, and it's one mirrored in, I would say, most of the corporate promotion around these tools, is that these tools are going to catapult farmers from their muddy boots, right? There's an abstraction into the creative economy. So farming is going to, right, become abstracted away from the material conditions of labor. So that farmer, for example, right, farming from the comfort of his living room, I mean, he's still a middle-aged man, which mirrors the reality of farming demographics today. But that person he's no longer in his muddy boots in the field, but farming from the comfort of his living room. And it's also that farm decision-making is promised, right, to be abstracted or perfected, actually, right? So that farm decisions made historically using a notepad and pen and then maybe an Excel spreadsheet are now going to be really directed by AI, right? That'll derive insights that this is at least the promise, that are far superior to any that a human could have, in part because of the machine learning ability to use, right, big data sets and mine those data sets for insights. So this is the promise, and it's mirrored across. In the book, I look at corporate promotion. I use the ethnographic work from the conventions and trade shows. I look at farm trade newspapers and journals. There's a pretty big corpus upon which I draw to make the claim that this is, right, one argument about what the future of farming looks like. And in the book, I also historicize these arguments. So you can actually trace them back, as I do in the book, to a history of promotion around agricultural technology since Jethro Tull's seed drill, right? That these farm technologies are going to help farmers be competitive against their neighbors, and that they're going to remove the arduous nature or distance the farmer from the arduous nature of farm labor, and also, and again, like create competitive advantage so a farmer can compete in what is, for all farmers, no matter their size, a really competitive sector. Okay, so here's just a few examples of this, of the idea of what the future of farming looks like, according to, so in this case, it's Agribusiness, Bayer Monsanto. So, you can see it kind of mirrors the John Deere video. The head of Bayer Monsanto Precision Agriculture or Digital Agriculture claims that, right, we're going to safeguard our food supply, so continue to produce enough food to feed a growing global population, which we know is a problem, but we're going to do so efficiently and sustainably, because using the AI-directed advice, we're going to minimize environmental impact. In some corporate clips, and promotional advertisements, mostly the claim is made even stronger, right? We're going to replace inputs. Tobias Mean, the head of Monsanto's precision agricultural program in 2018, said we're going to replace inputs by information. So that abstracting claim. But you even see it in the technical literature. So I did a meta review of the journal Precision Agriculture, which is mostly where technical folks publish on this topic. And right, these two academics in 2004 make a very similar claim, right? This is a paradigm shift, they call it, in agriculture, driven by AI, where we're going to substitute environmental information for physical inputs. Okay, so we're running through things here, but yeah. So, we can see here that, like, within this promise about competitive advantage, which is very much aimed at the farmer, there are also broader promises around broader social change that's going to attend the implementation of these technologies, feeding the world, right? And there's like a kind of moral claims making that happens. And I really unpack this, and I do so theoretically and empirically in the book. But I won't say much more about this, except for to say that I also trace this messaging onto the farm. So I talked to farmers, the ones adopting these tools. And you can see that actually the farmers who are adopting the precision or decision support tools actually also use this as a, they justify their purchasing, and they really believe that they're going to make more precise decisions, and it's going to be part of their both their competitive advantage, but also their environmental an aim toward environmental stewardship and sustainable land management. Okay, but I want to introduce you to the alternative vision now, which is the one that I initially thought was located, and it was true, located among these farmer activists and hacktivists. So if the dominant vision for the future of digital agriculture involves the conspicuous absence of the farmer, right, who's been replaced both in terms of physical labor, but also intelligence by AI, there's a group of farmers who actually think that big data and even algorithms shared openly in open data contexts, and decision support platforms produced openly, say on a GitHub platform, and other tools shared according to Copyright Commons, for example. So a different model of innovation building. This group of farmers believes that actually farmers are central to innovation, are going to remain so, right? That this should be farmer-centered and actually led innovation in a kind of social movement project, both in terms of the kind of farming that these folks envision as good farming, which rather than facing the international marketplace and growing commodities, is farming that's aimed at local food systems and food sovereignty, and actually on very biodiverse farm environments, in many cases agroecological. And here's just one example of this and open. I interacted with several groups in the US and one group in Quebec in Canada, but one group is FarmOS, and you may have heard of them. They're the most prominent. And they are an open source, right, mostly volunteer group of coders, including farmers, who are building a decision support platform for farm decision making. The FarmOS leader, Dorn Cox, told me that with FarmOS, we're able to have democratized access to environmental data so that anybody has access to low-cost data and has high participation. Okay. One volunteer coder for FarmOS told me that what we care about is the idea of a shared commons, right? It's community building and it's collective action, and there's a sense of shared responsibility. And she told me that the tools are actually, the way they're building the tools is in line with resilience and the kind of model of agriculture they're hoping to realize. That kind of, data science and agricultural science are interconnected, she told me. Okay, so you're starting to get a sense, and I outlined it in much more detail in the book in two distinct chapters, but right here were these two models that I thought initially that I would hinge the whole book around, developing their differences, right? We have private-led innovation, we have activist innovation, and despite their differences, which I outline in this table, around how data should be collected and shared or not, right? How technologies ought to be developed, and their differences in terms of how the scientists define good agriculture. Everyone, I realized after 2 years of fieldwork, and actually really after systematically coding, we say in social science, or analyzing my data, I noticed something, that everyone was talking about data actually in a very similar way. So despite the differences, right, in terms of the values around data science and agriculture, everyone was talking about data in the same way. And that is as if it dropped from the sky, right? Or was pulled from the ground, as if data are unmediated by human action. But also, I noticed that there was a social force that attended this way of talking about data, that the people who were using this way of talking about data, what I call the immaculate conception of data, were doing so because of its performative value. They were doing so as a kind of pitch, either to convince me as a social science researcher of the value of their activist project, or in a pitch to a bid to get massive amounts of federal government funding, or in advertising to sell farmers tools. And so what the book really tries to do is not just describe this immaculate conception of data, but make sense of using science and technology scholarship, its social force. And so I'm going to get into this very, very briefly, and then I'll be done. Okay. So So after 2 years of fieldwork, I noticed that despite the obvious differences that I outlined in that table, everyone was framing agricultural problems as requiring big data and AI. And moreover, everyone was describing data as if they dropped from the sky or are raw resources pulled from the ground. Also, everyone described big data and AI systems as autonomous and agential, right? As existing outside of humans, but also inevitably or inexorably driving a kind of social change. Other scholars, and I'm clear about sort of setting this up in the book, but have talked about what they call cultural fantasies in one case around data and AI. So Ian Bogost, for example, has an article in The Atlantic called The Cathedral of Computation, where he describes a near sort of religiosity toward algorithmic logic. Kate Crawford, very well known, talks about data fundamentalism, right? A belief that data provide truth. And so, but I came to see the Immaculate Conception of Data is not just an annoying neologism like social scientists like to do, but it's a bit different because I came to see the Immaculate Conception of Data, sorry, I thought I had a slide on this, not as epistemic distortion, right? Or like religiosity or false belief, but actually, as I said before, as performative. Another way of saying this is I'm positive that all of the scientists I engage with and the farmers and everyone, they would not hold true to the premises of the Immaculate Conception of Data, right? These were the same people, and I detail this in the book, who were toiling to bring data sets into being, who were ground truthing algorithmic tools. In many cases, the tools weren't working. It was a messy human-machine compromise or dance. And so they're the very humans working, right? So why would they eviscerate themselves or obfuscate themselves? And so I came to see it was performative, that, and then as I said in the book, right, I use science and technology studies scholarship that talks about the relationship between values and science, or values and technology, to try to make sense of why people are using the Immaculate Conception of Data. And it's this, quite simply, that, right, if one can talk about a technology as standing outside of human values or humans, but then like as corollary, human values or interests, right, then that connotes a kind of objectivity or a certain interpretation of objectivity, and therefore a power, right, for your system. And so it was that power dimension that I really try to illustrate and use STS scholarship to explain or show in the book. Okay, so the Immaculate Conception of Data was intended as a, sorry, I had a slide on that, as a meeting ground between folks like Lev Manovich, Kate Crawford, Ian Bogost, and science and technology scholarship, which helps us really not just describe these views that people have on data or ways of speaking, habits of speech and thought, but also explain it, right? Because of its social force. Because we can see throughout history, here's the proper place for this slide, that, and I detail this in the book, champions of this view throughout history in terms of like early industrialization or the colonial project, it's been a winning strategy, a winning way of talking about science and technology. Okay, I don't have time to get into it in any more depth, but so in calling the imaginary I discuss in the book ICD, I pull on multiple cultural threads that bind our relationship to science and technology. Just like Mary's conception of Jesus, right? Clean, it confers a power on her and God simultaneously, or like Donna Haraway's God trick, right? If the data simply exist in their purity, they confer a power to those offering putatively data-driven programs for societal reform. Okay, so longstanding cultural ideas of technological neutrality and power, and also futurism, which I actually realize I haven't talked about at all, are what I talk about in the book. And here's just two examples. So this is a, I was talking to Tim, an agribusiness scientist, who was telling me about the benefits of his weed identification system, who said, right, human reading of data is not scalable. Information doesn't play into the bigger picture. If the system sees a viral plant, it has seen all viral plants, and well, it just knows, right? So talking about a system as agential and knowing, right, omniscient. And then this is a quotation from a public sector scientist. I talked with her in a late afternoon in a windowless government office, and she told me, right, we know we map across Canada, and then we use this algorithm, and we know every field in the country, what's growing in it. We can characterize the soil, and boy, it's really powerful just to know through our algorithm. And as I said in the book, I detail not just people talking about or leveraging the Immaculate conception of data, but also the way it works for them. Okay, so ultimately, though, in the book, in the last chapter of the book, I talk about how even though it's a powerful and performative framework, it's hazardous. And here I'm alluding to a great essay by the historian of technology, Leo Marx, Technology, a Hazardous Concept. I think ICD is a hazardous framework because even though it might be a winning strategy for getting you money or getting you support as an activist from the US aid, it's hazardous because it invisibilizes the people working behind these data systems and algorithms, and therefore it makes less visible what I would call the political economies and even the moral orders that have come to define food systems in everyday lives. I briefly mentioned the political economy of ag is problematic. There's whole bodies of scholarship on that. But again, agribusinesses are big tech far before social media, and their concentrated market power raises real social justice and environmental justice problems. ICD closes down precise and fruitful lines of inquiry that would help us care for AI. Who wrote this AI? In what ways do they stand to gain from its use? Which variables are data collected on which variables? Why these variables versus others? Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Professor Bronson. That was like one of the best 20-minute summaries of a book I've ever seen. I mean, you sort of pointed us to where there was more detail, but then I feel like we got the big picture. So that was amazing. Thank you. So if it's okay, I'm just I have a sort of few prepared questions that I can ask to maybe dig a little deeper, invite you to maybe tell some of the more narrative stories that you glossed over here, and then we can have a few minutes at the end for kind of open Q&A from the audience. So if you've got a sort of burning question, feel free to put it in the chat and or just sort of raise your hand towards the end. But maybe to get us started, one thing I'm curious about, especially in light of Rosita's comments about this workshop and how it's becoming a bit more of a hot topic. So in the introduction of your book, you initially framed it as this, I'm quoting here, attempts to fill in a gap in critical academic as well as public discourse surrounding agricultural big data. Right. So the idea is you could go to these critical data science conferences and then, like you said, like 2 people show up to your talk on ag, right? And it was just sort of like, we want to talk about Facebook, we want to talk about Google. And then, so you say by 2018, the project had become an inquiry into the existence of that gap itself. And so I guess what I want to ask first is, do you think that gap still exists in 2023 today?
Yeah, that's a great question. I also noted when Rosita said that. Because I feel that she and I, perhaps for disciplinary reasons, or I'm not quite sure, and I have some thoughts on this, maybe she does too, have different perspectives on how hot a topic this is. But and just to be clear, Rosita was at that conference that I talk about in the opening chapter of the book. I talk about Mike Caroline and I, but actually I had met Rosita at a data challenge in Fredericton where we were both judges. On a big data visualization challenge, and I invited Rosita to that conference, so she was actually on that panel. So Rosita, I don't know if you read that little story in the book, but you were there. Where I don't know if you remember, yes, nobody attended our panel on agriculture, right? And I would say that I'm still, for example, like I have real trouble raising this conversation. I would say. So to answer your question, I still think there's a gap, and maybe the distinction is there's a gap in, I would say, critical, right, focus, and so among like critical social scientists, and just relative to the huge, right, it could even as a name, techlash, right, the kind of like quit Facebook and the kind of everyday awareness, the popular kind of critical awareness, but also scholarly awareness around the potential misuses of data, right, in terms of their impact on gaming the political system, on reproducing harm, but also on the concentration of power and corporate power. I would say that I still don't see that conversation. In 2016, I published a few pieces saying, come on, data studies scholars, where are you? And come on, food studies scholars. And now there's a group of us internationally. But I could almost count the people on, two hands. But there is a sort of more critical conversation, I would say, happening, being led from the global South. So around data colonialism, there's a working group that I'm on that's connects with some watchdog organizations like ETC Group, but also it's like Via Campesina and like global peasant farmers. And there is a critical, the two aren't really connected, as in like the conversation that's happening in Europe and North America, the critical conversation with the global Southern one. But also I would say, like, where's the broad public awareness? And you're right, I opened the book with Cambridge Analytica, but also the consolidation of Bayer Monsanto and the lawsuits, right? The glyphosate lawsuits. Like, amidst all of this critical attention to Monsanto around GMOs, I'm not saying normatively there ought to be like down with Monsanto, but I was just curious, right? As a line of inquiry, where is this attention? So I would say I see that gap less, but I still see it, to be honest. And so it's curious. Yeah, Rosita says it's a hot topic, but maybe it's like, there's a lot of enthusiasm, which I outline in the book, around the potential, the positive potentials of big data and AI in agriculture, so-called digital agriculture or agriculture 4.0. But I think the gap is around the critical attention. I still see it. I still feel like I'm trying to raise this conversation among folks otherwise really interested, like with CFAR, for example. Hey, Graham, I feel like you have connections to CFAR. I feel like I apply to every CFAR thing and they're like, oh, agriculture. I mean, they don't say it like that, but anyway, I feel like I'm trying to have a kind of boring conversation amidst a really lively hot topic, which is like social justice and AI. And I think there's something about that that has to do with the nature of the data and the nature of the harms, right? Environmental data, really, versus personal data collected online, right? We have great legal tools, and even like within ethics of engineering, like to understand kind of harms to, private property and person, and environmental data have almost always existed in the public realm. I mean, Indigenous peoples would say, like, I'm making that claim somewhat uncarefully, but that's the assumption, right? And so I think there's something about the nature of the data that makes the harms a little bit less visible. And the harms are less, it's not like a recidivism app that's putting, or algorithm that's putting Black people disproportionately in jail, right? It's like, well, maybe we're reproducing corporate concentration in ag, which, in 20 years maybe means Monsanto owns all of these really important data sets that could help us mitigate climate change. But that's like 20, 30 years down the road, and it's harder to see. It's a bit of a slow burn.
Right. And it's just like, I mean, what I loved about the intro of the book too is like, I feel like a priori you would predict this would be a bigger deal, right? Because there's like all the sort of public backlash around glyphosate and Roundup, right? And big ag was just like an easy punching bag for, so many people, right? And it seems like there's still that gap. So I'd really like the, kind of comment in the end of your remarks there about explaining why that might be. So the nature of the kind of environmental data, I think, may go some way to explain that. That's interesting. So maybe I want to ask a question about the immaculate conception of data. And so I liked the introduction you gave in the slides. And so there seems to be this defining feature that the data are like raw and that they provide truths about the world as it really is. And then you did a nice job of sort of suggesting like the motivations for that view and the kind of performative value of just, even if you don't believe it, sort of messaging data as if it had that characteristic. So I'm wondering what you think about the immaculate conception of data in light of large language models like ChatGPT that are all the rage right now. Because like I only thought about this during your presentation, but like there does seem to be a sense in which the training data sets that make possible these large language models are ones that like they're nothing but a record of human intervention, right? It's like text that a journalist wrote and that we posted about things on Reddit. So I mean, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts about like how that immaculate conception of data framework would apply to the case of large language models and all the AI that's being very much hyped right now.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have thought about this a bit because, of course, like, the book was published before, before all of this. And I don't know even how to describe this. And it's all happening quickly, and it's a site of a lot of attention for good reason right now. I would say, maybe I said it in the talk, but even though the book is about agricultural big data and AI, kind of, in that it's ethnographic and I follow the scientists in these particular contexts of AI production, I would say that this framework that I witnessed, that was empirically grounded, so I witnessed it being used in these contexts, but it far exceeds the ag domain. I know that's not exactly your question, but I think it's important to say, I'm not sure if I said it in the talk, that, really the book is not, well, at least this part of the book, this framework, I think is everywhere. And maybe now you'll start to see it everywhere. And again, others have pointed it out, right? Like Jeffrey Bowker a long time ago, the geographer, said raw data is an oxymoron. And so that we talk about data as if they're raw or natural resources, even the language of data mining. Other people in critical data studies have pointed that out. Or even if you think about the work, more closely aligned with AI science, like Joseph Weizenbaum and automation bias, right? But I would say that what's different about ICD is that, again, it is the performative nature, right? I'm quite sure that actually nobody's operating under a distorted epistemic view on data, that no one would really say, oh yeah, and I think it's true, even as sophisticated and terrifying, to be honest, as ChatGPT is, I feel like most scientists would say, of course, this thing is a product of humans in the first place, but it doesn't seem that way. And so, and anyway, so ICD far exceeds the ag domain. I'm sure we probably see it in the way that GPT is talked about, but I again don't believe that anyone who's actually on the ground as a practicing scientist would hold true to the tenets of ICD. So the question becomes, why do we talk about it that way? And I think in the case of large neuronal networks and language processing, and I feel like maybe I don't know, because I haven't done this comparative analysis, but I actually feel like the reasons why ICD might travel or be used more broadly in the case of those tools might be slightly different than in the case of agriculture. As you said, or like a lot of people are divorced from food. They don't think of agribusinesses as big tech. And then for the reasons I already mentioned, people might use the ICD in the context of ag. But I actually think in the case of these sophisticated AI, it's maybe the nature of the sophistication or the level of the sophistication. I don't know I wonder what the AI scientists would have to say, but
yeah, I mean, I think it's great, and I appreciate you sort of going off script.
Yeah,
off
sorry,
script a
I'm a
little bit,
bit
right?
like
Because of course you're not like a large language
back
model
of the envelope thinking here.
Yeah. So I mean, right. So maybe to bring it back to the ag context a little bit. So I liked in the presentation you sort of showed that John Deere video, and in the book you go into analyzing a lot of the corporate messaging around agricultural productivity. And so you often, use this phrase like productivism through precision technology, or productivism through digital agriculture. So I'm wondering if you could maybe just, say a little bit for folks that might not be, maybe familiar with that sort of sociological context, like what you mean by the logic of productivism, and then maybe just give an example of something that you think illustrates its salient features or is really illustrative for your purposes.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that invitation, because productivism is kind of a dirty word, actually, or it's contentious. It's used mostly among critical food studies scholars, I would say, or political economists who study food and the food system. And a lot of people would perhaps take umbrage with the use of that word, but I use it because I think it's pretty accurate. And this is how I would describe it, I think, borrowing from Fred Boutel, who's a political economist of ag. It's basically an agricultural model or set of values for what is good agriculture that describes good agriculture as agriculture that's intensely sort of scientized or technologized, so very industrialized, and which produces commodities for exports. It's sort of by its very nature the beginning of productivism, located in the early 20th century, right, as a kind of policy mandate, I would say, or vision for what is good agriculture. And it really starts in Canada in 1969, the Task Force on Agriculture, this document where, the Canadian government said, actually, good farms should get bigger, right, grow commodity crops. And actually, by doing that, we're going to drive down commodity prices, but that's good because then we'll weed out irrational actors, or meaning the smaller farmers, right? And therefore, sort of by default, weed out locally facing food systems, right? And so its productivism is not just industrialized agriculture, but agriculture facing a global marketplace, where really the reigning value is agriculture's contribution to gross domestic product. So the value is economic. The value set gets lost, as it often does, right? So it's explicit in the sort of early to mid 20th century in policy documents around agriculture in Canada, for example, as I've analyzed them, but then the values get lost. And so this is how productivism becomes a dirty word, because for critical food studies scholars, it's, you know, all about kind of corporate power concentration and these sort of environmental and social justice harms from that model of agriculture. But for a lot of people, it's taken for granted, right? This is, I would say, the reigning paradigm within agriculture, Agri-Food Canada, and policy and around agriculture today. And it's just so taken for granted that, for example, in 2017, I was at a table at an agricultural technology conference with people from StatsCan, and I said, hey, do you think it's a problem that, like, what about the smaller farmers? And none of the private sector innovation seems to be, you know, and that makes sense, I said, because of course, you know, the private companies, that's not their market. But should the government be doing something to kind of fill gaps in the tech innovation ecosystem around AI for these small scale farmers? And what about biodiversity? And, you know, what about tools for biodiversity or ecosystem services, or anyway? And this, and someone from StatsCan said, that's so ridiculous. We don't need those farmers. We don't want those farmers. Like, it's not a tech equity issue if you actually think those farmers are irrational economic actors, right? What we need is only the big farms, because they do contribute really significantly to social policy via their contribution to GDP. But so this is an explicit paradigm, but not explicitly a values-based paradigm. Yeah, so that's productivism. Does that help?
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, I think the sort of historical context there is super helpful, because, you know, you might be tempted to read the book coming away thinking like, oh, you know, precision agriculture is an expression of this, but it seems like your view is very much, it has a much longer history that goes back much further. And what we now talk about as precision agriculture is just a very natural extension, or just sort of falls out very naturally from that kind of reigning ideology, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if you remember, but in the beginning of the book, I say, like, actually one of my major sort of in terms of the gambit of the book or the overall approach, my inspiration was this book called When Old Technologies Are New by Carolyn Marvin, which was really about like print-based media versus electronic media. So the book is old, but, you know, she does this great thing where she asks, okay, amidst all of this talk about novelty and innovation, and here's where the futurism part of my book comes in, right? I didn't want to play into that narrative, which is actually, you know, critical social scientists succumb to that narrative as much as the proponents, right? In that, like, the future is going to, on the one hand, it's dystopic, or, you know, on the other hand, utopic, but I didn't want to play into that futurism. I wanted to instead ask, you know, not so much what changes, but what stays the same, especially vis-a-vis power, economic power, but also power among social groups. So among farmers, right, the large commodity farmers versus the smaller, you know, I would say more biodiverse farmer facing a local food system, but also among businesses. And that's really the gross disparity, is among the agribusinesses as qua big tech companies now, and farmers and citizens.
Yeah, it's great. So that's like a perfect segue to the question I was most excited to ask you about. So, you know, some of us on the call have been, you know, reading and discussing the work of the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, and so I don't know if you're familiar with any of his stories or any of his. Yeah, so I mean, it doesn't matter. So he was recently on an episode of the Ezra Klein podcast, and he had this claim that's like really been kind of an earworm for me ever since I heard it. And so I'll read part of it. So he says that I tend to think that most fears about AI are best understood as fears about capitalism. And I think that this is actually true of most fears of technology too. Most of our fears or anxieties about technology are best understood as fears or anxiety about how capitalism will use technology against us. And technology and capitalism have been so closely intertwined that it's hard to distinguish the two. And so, like, for me, as someone who works in the AI ethics space, this has been like, it's almost like you just sort of swap the word AI for capitalism and then see how much of the critique still holds. And I think he captures like just quite a lot of what shows up in critical data studies and kind of ethical, legal, social implications of AI. And so I guess I want to, you know, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that in the context of big data agriculture. Like, you know, how many of the worries that you raise in the book are specific to like ag tech? And how many, you know, you think are just sort of the symptoms of this broader kind of like the way that capitalism and technology are intertwined, and just kind of fears or anxieties about the way it gets used? So I know there's a lot in there, but I'm just wondering if you can sort of reflect on some of those themes.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's great. You know, I do cite the wonderful book by Shoshana Zuboff, and I use the concept of surveillance capitalism, whatever her title is, something in the age of surveillance capitalism, in the book, because I think, you know, that's so important, to see that, you know, the misuses of big data and algorithms are not something that are not to be circumscribed as a technical problem, right? It's a social problem, and it's a suprastructural, including capitalism problem, right? So for example, we all know now probably, but right, like, you know, some of the misuses of data, think of Cambridge Analytica, for example, are a product largely of the value proposition of data, which is a problem with the political economy of online space, right? It's not a problem of bad actors online, right? This is as much as Mark Zuckerberg, I was just going to say Zuck, as much as Mark Zuckerberg would like us, right, to believe that it's a problem that can be fixed, right? That, you know, just weed out bad actors using good bots. It's not a technical, it's a social or socio-technical problem. And so, yeah, I love that quotation, and I'm a firm believer that one has to attend to those. And that's what that exactly that you infer, that's what I try to do in the book. I would say that I wouldn't reduce it all, though, to capitalism. I think, you know, largely, and I've talked about it mostly today, problems, social justice, environmental problems coming from food system, the way it's structured, have to do with the political economy of how it's structured, for sure. But it's not just that, right? And so I try to show the integration, right, of cultural habits, ways of thinking, that I think are as much a part of the problem as the suprastructural problem. And you know, why do I think that's important? Because, you know, if you frame it as a technical problem, then you limit the solution space, right? Then it's just like, okay, it's a problem for engineers, even, you know, well-meaning engineers interested in ethics. But if you broaden it, okay, it's a capitalism problem. Okay, well, then the problem is just one of reorganizing the economy, sort of. But I think power is much more insidious, right? I think, you know, it's like, you know, is the problem then one of anti-competition? And of course, in Europe, we've seen, like, through Margaret Vestager's great work has been done to kind of move the needle in terms of regulating big tech, and even the kind of political economic power advantage of big tech using, say, privacy legislation or anti-competition legislation. And the same thing with privacy. But I feel like it's none of these things on its own, right? It's not a privacy issue. It's not a anti-competition issue, and it's not you know, it's also culture. Yeah, and that's an annoying academic thing to say. It's all of these things playing together. It's not an easy. I mean, this is the problem that I would say the left has in general, which is it's not easy to say, okay, we can solve, right? When Mark Zuckerberg goes to the, you know, testifies again to Congress and says, well, we can solve this problem, just give us some money and we'll design. That's so much easier than saying, actually, we all have to participate in talking about these things differently. We have to use anti-competition law and privacy law and think of human rights and think of social justice, bring more people to the table. Yeah, it's just like so complicated, but.
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that that's like exactly the sort of right kind of measured response, even if it is like the exact same academic one I would make too. Okay, so maybe I'll just ask like two more questions and then we can open it up, because you've given us sort of, you know, a lot of good food for thought here. So I think one of the things I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. So it seems like both, you know, in the US and Canada, political pundits get a lot of mileage out of this claim that like certain features of the so-called like urban-rural divide go a long way to explaining sort of certain features of political polarization in our political landscape, things like that. So I'm curious about like how your work on this book, where it's like on the one hand, you know, the sort of like high-tech industrialism we associate with, you know, urban centers, right? And then, you know, agriculture, which we tend to associate with rural centers. I'm just curious, like, how your work on this book changed your own thinking about the urban-rural divide in Canada.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Can I add an addendum to your prior question? Because
Please, yeah.
It's so insufficient to leave it like it's so messy and I was thinking, you know, pedagogy. I mean, obviously I do what I do because I'm a firm believer in social change via learning. But when you talk about like engineering and ethics, and I think about the modules for engineers and thinking through ethical situations or scenarios, right? maybe one solution to getting at the complexity is to not just think about, right, infringement on privacy, right, in those modules or human rights, but also to think about values more broadly, right, as they influence technical work. And so upstream, right, getting engineers and data scientists, computer scientists, and all of us to think really carefully about, right, the complexity of a value system that might influence one's technical work, right, including economic values. But okay, so your question about, rural and urban. I think about this a lot, actually, because I was born in Toronto, like inner city. It was, when my neighborhood was not fancy. I was an inner city kid. And, then I went to Queen's University and studied plant biology. I have 2 degrees in plant science, actually. And it was like, I left the lab bench and I moved to Saskatchewan to study farmers. And that was like a real, I remember I was read by many farmers as like, I was called the city girl. And, it's not like I grew up in an agricultural family. And so why study food? That divide is real, I guess, is what I'm saying. And, most of us, and I think this relates to why frameworks like Immaculate Conception of Data circulate, but also why there isn't the critical attention to agricultural big data. Most of us are quite divorced, right, from our food environments. Like we just go to the grocery store. And I think a survey just came out, a Pew survey, that like 60-some% of school age children in Canada think a carrot comes from the grocery store, right? Like they don't know it first came from the ground.
Or like chocolate milk comes from a brown cow. And it's just like
exactly, right? So there is that, like, and then when you think about the seat of decision making, right, it's like federal, and so I was this city kid who went to Saskatchewan, and it was a real, like, what would we call it, like a reverse, it's a good kind of ethical exercise where I was read as totally other, and farmers didn't really initially want to engage with me. And because the sort of the seat of decision making is seen to be so far from the real lives of people in rural spaces, right? And it comes with all sorts of problems, including bias and policy making. And so, I think that's very real, that distance you're talking about, both kind of like ideological, but also actual in terms of participation in consequential decisions. And actually, like a large part of my work now, in a kind of interventionist way, tries to seek redress for that. So, for example, I'm about to host workshops with small scale farmers, thinking through possible innovations in AI for small scale and biodiverse farmers. And and they're sited on farms, right? So like we don't bring them into the University of Ottawa. We go there. And I think more of that needs to happen. And actually the workshops are going to bring together technologists, policymakers, and farmers in what I kind of like to think of as a reality TV show, right? Where, it's important for farmers to understand the kind of complexity of federal policy making, I think, because it's not easy, I'm sure. But it's also important for farmers to hear, for policymakers to hear from farmers directly, and not just those farmers who, again, are part of this broader paradigm or imagination, the Midwestern grain farmer, but farmers that farm vegetables in the Outaouais region.
Great. So maybe the last question I'll ask, which sort of dovetails with that before we kind of open it up. You mentioned in your summary that this is like almost primarily an ethnographic work. And so of course we should give you some space to, tell stories and talk about the stories. So you sort of hinted at one sort of solution there in your last response, but I mean, I'm curious if you have like a favorite example from the book of one of these kind of hacktivist movements that are building open data platforms as a way to kind of counter the dominance of the sort of first vision that you laid out. So do you just have a favorite story you'd like to share, or one that you think is like promising as a social movement that offers lessons for others? Kind of just like open-ended question there.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, I have to say, I really enjoyed my time with the farmer hacktivists. I think they're all doing great work. And, partly I felt badly in the end, talking about the Immaculate Conception of Data and sort of implicating everyone, including myself and critical social scientists, in that framework, because really my like food politics, and even I would say my tech politics in terms of open innovation and open science, are with the activists. But in the end, I saw that the ICD, that everyone was participating in it, using it, where it was really working at cross purposes with that activist. So I would say the activists are doing, lots of them, great things to, as you say, kind of counter the the asymmetry, to push for alternative agriculture more broadly and alternative ways of organizing data, like opening data sets, for example. And the activist groups, connect with other groups who are far more organized around open data, like Godin, for example. Some great projects. Well, there's so the group in Quebec, it's part of a co-op that I spent time with. It's part of a cooperative called CAPE. They have a subgroup that builds digital tools, and they do so in workshop settings. So it's like really cool spaces of innovation. And, some of them are more on the production end of things, like sensors for greenhouses. But actually what I found was really interesting about those activist groups, and this I only learned through spending tons of time with them, and is that actually their site for digital innovating is often kind of off the farm. So this group, for example, and so here's, I guess, a story. There's this one farm Tournesol in Quebec, so sunflower farm. Reed Alloway is the head farmer there. They rather than actually, so one of the interesting things about that farm is Reed told me, I don't want technology to automate laborers. In fact, I'm trying to bring laborers as a kind of family. And they have this kind of ad hoc family on Reed's farm, right? Of woofers, people who use that volunteer programming, volunteers and his family, and they're all kind of this extended Alloway family. And so what they're looking for is tools that actually can just augment labor, right? And make it a little bit easier at their scale of farming. And so they don't need big machinery. In fact, the big machinery would compact the soil, and they think that in a way they think is detrimental. So what they're doing is really interesting things, like buying old tractors, as in before even diesel or fuel-based tractors, and hacking them. So steam, so using a metal cutter to cut a tractor in half, and then buying a battery and sort of hacking the tractor into a battery tractor that's of the appropriate scale for their farm, which is super cool. And actually to fill gaps in the innovation ecosystem, and I have a little video actually that talks about this innovation work. Ryan Thiessen, who was a farmer in the Niagara region, has now developed a business called Thiessen Technologies, building these battery boxes himself using digital tools with a CEGEP. So it's this really interesting, that maybe wasn't so much of a story, but some of the really neat things that these groups are doing. And that gives me hope. One of the, I think that, obviously we can't all have local food all the time, and that's not a feasible proposition. But I do believe for environmental and social reasons in creating more sort of locally resilient food systems. And I think these farmers are doing really interesting things with digital tools to achieve that. One of the main problems is just that they're all doing it voluntarily, right? They have no resources relative to the private-led innovation. There's this grand asymmetry, not just in the promotion, right? As I said before, Canadian government is very captured by precision agriculture, but defined a very particular way. But also in terms of the money, the activists have no resources, including time, perhaps most importantly, time.
Right, but I mean, I like that story as an example of it can sort of happen at the level of kind of hardware and sensors, but also data and platforms. And so sort of throughout the whole life cycle, there's these sort of possibilities for, I guess, different ways of doing things.
And a whole geography of, right,
right.
With the digital laser cutter and 3D printers and the CEGEP, and kind of a lot of the digital tools that these farmers are using, these hacktivists, are actually off farm, and they wouldn't count currently under, that's what Ryan Thiessen says. He's finding it's hard to get federal support for his innovation because they don't count as precision agriculture or innovation even.
Right, even though they're building tools that are hyper specific to the needs of that farm, right? Yeah, that's an interesting oversight. Well, look, I've got a list of 10 more questions and we could go on, but I know there's a lot of people, who are excited to come to your talk and are probably, sitting here impatiently waiting to ask too. So if anyone else has a question, feel free